In sociology, we're always talking about how we operationalize our variables. What we have this thing that we're interested in. What are the measures that we can go out in the community and measure, whether they're survey data or official data from the Census Bureau or things like that? What can we use to best approximate this variable? When you're talking about something like political extremism, how do you, how do we measure that? How do we operationalize that variable? What are the types of things that you as a data scientist would look for to approximate a measure for political extremism?
So one of the things that's been enormously helpful to us in the work that we've done in this Pacific Northwest project is to look at the dynamics of protests that have been happening. And clearly in 2020, we saw like a huge spike in protests nationwide on both the left and the right, brought on by the Black Lives Matter movement, and of course the COVID restrictions. And we saw in those spilled over into 2020-21 as well. And in some respects have continued on, although not to the same degree since then. But what we do is we monitor those protests and take a look at things that may be precursors to violence. So we look at whether or not violence actually broke out. And by violence, I mean physical violence. So we also encode the protests for whether or not there was property damage done. But in the Pacific Northwest Project, what we're really interested in doing is reducing interpersonal violence where people actually get hurt. That's what we want to avoid. So we're not trying to draw people back from feeling what they feel or expressing their First Amendment rights. We just would like to see it done more peacefully. So we look at these protests and we look at what was going on, what were the topics of the protest, did people show up armed to the protest, was there a counter protest also involved? And that's oftentimes actually where the violence is most likely to break out, when there's a protest, counter protest. The presence of firearms also seems to be a big risk factor for violence breaking out. And so it's not even necessarily that the firearms were used. It just seems to be a risk factor for it escalating the situation to violence. And this has certainly been seen in other contexts for violence as well, where the presence of firearms can basically make people feel more likely to act out on whatever is making them angry. So we've heavily relied on that data. And one of the nice things about it is it's both temporal and geospatial. And so from the geospatial data, we can look at what was going on in those communities, like what other things are going on in those communities, what perhaps needs are being unmet in those communities that may be driving people to feel the need to get out and not only protest, but protest violently. Because when you think about it, it's one thing to get out and express your First Amendment right, but if you're so angry about something that you're willing to act out violently, that's an end stage of a process that likely took months, years to get to that point. And so one of the things that we've really tried to understand in this project, put a lot of work into understanding, is looking at what's going on in those communities that may be making them a breeding ground for this problem.